5. October 15th, Monday. Every morning when he woke up now, Asakawa found himself wishing that it had all been a dream. He called a rent-a-car place in the neighborhood and told them that he'd be in on schedule to pick up the car he'd reserved. They had his reservation on file, no mistake. Reality marched on without a break. He needed a way to get around if he was going to try and find out where that broadcast had originated. It would be too hard to break in on TV frequencies with an off-the-shelf wireless transmitter. He figured that it had to have been done with an expertly modified unit. And the image on the tape was clear, with no interference. That meant that the signal had to have been strong and close. With more information, he might have been able to establish the area in which the broadcast was receivable, and thus to pinpoint the point of origin. But all he had to go on was the fact that the television in Villa Log Cabin B4 had picked up the transmission. All he could do was go there, check out the lay of the land, and then start going over the area with a fine-toothed comb. He had no idea how long it would take. He packed enough clothes for 3 days. He certainly wouldn't need any more than that. He and Shizu looked at each other, but Shizu didn't say anything about the video. Asakawa hadn't been able to think of a good lie, and so he'd let her go to bed with only the vaguest of excuses about the threat of death in a week. For her part, Shizu seemed to fear finding out anything specific, and seemed happy to let things remain ambiguous and unexplained. Rather than questioning him like she usually would, she seemed to guess at something on her own that made her keep an eerie silence. Asakawa didn't know exactly how she was interpreting things, but it didn't seem to assuage her uneasiness. As she watched her usual morning soap opera on TV, she seemed extraordinarily sensitive to noises from outside, starting from her seat any number of times. "Let's just not talk about this, okay? I don't have any answers for you. Just let me handle it." This was all Asakawa could think to say to calm his wife's anxieties. He couldn't allow himself to appear weak to his wife. Just as he was stepping out of the house, as if on cue, the phone rang. It was Ryuji. "I've made a fascinating discovery. I want you to tell me what you think." There was a hint of excitement in Ryuji's voice. "Can't you tell me about it over the phone? I'm supposed to go pick up a rental car." "A rental car? You're the one who told me to find out where the broadcast originated from." Right. Listen, put that on the back burner for a while and get over here. Maybe you don't have to go looking for an antenna after all. Maybe that whole premise will just crumble away. Asakawa decided to pick up the car first anyway, so that if he still needed to go to South Akone Pacific Land, he could leave straight from Ryuji's place. Asakawa parked the car with 2 wheels up on the sidewalk and banged on Ryuji's door. "Enter!" "It's unlocked." Asakawa jerked the door open and deliberately stomped through the kitchen. "So what's this big discovery?" he asked, forcefully. "What's eating you?" Ryuji glanced over from where he sat, cross-legged on the floor. "Just hurry up and tell me what you found." "Relax! How am I supposed to relax? Just tell me already!" Ryuji held his tongue for a moment. Then, gently, he asked, "What's wrong? Did something happen?" Asakawa plopped himself down in the middle of the floor, clenching his hands on his knees. My wife and daughter watched that piece of shit." "Well, that's a hell of a thing. I'm sorry to hear that." Ryuji watched until Asakawa began to regain his composure. The latter sneezed once and blew his nose loudly. "Well, you want to save them too, don't you?" Asakawa nodded his head like a little boy. "Well then, all the more reason to keep a cool head. So I won't tell you my conclusions. I'll just lay out the evidence. I want to see what the evidence suggests to you first. That's why I couldn't have you excited like that, see? I understand, Asakawa said, meekly. Now go wash your face or something. Pull yourself together. Asakawa could cry in front of Ryuji. Ryuji was the outlet for all the emotions he couldn't break down and show his wife. He came back into the room, wiping his face with a towel, and Ryuji held out a piece of paper. On it was a simple chart. Number 1. Intro 83 seconds, in brackets 0. Abstract. Number 2. Red fluid 49, in brackets 0. Abstract. Number 3. Mount Bahada 55, in brackets 11. Real. Number 4. Mount Bahada erupting 32, in brackets 6. Real. Number 5. The word mountain 56, in brackets 0. Abstract. Number 6. Dice 103, in brackets 0. Abstract. Number 7. Old woman 111, in brackets 0. Abstract. Number 8. Infant 125, in brackets 33. Real. Number 9. Faces 117, in brackets 0. Abstract. Number 10. Old TV 141, in brackets 35. Real. Number 11. Man's face 186, in brackets 44. Real. Number 12. Ending 132, in brackets 0. Abstract. Some things were clear at a glance. Ryuji had broken down the video into separate scenes. Last night, I suddenly got the idea for this. You see what it is, right? The video consists of 12 scenes. I've given each one a number and a name. The number after the name is the length of the scene in seconds. The next number, in brackets, is, are you with me? The number of times the screen goes dark during that scene. Asakawa's expression was full of doubt. After you left yesterday, I started to examine other scenes besides the one with the infant, to see if they had any of these instances of darkness, too. And, lo and behold, there were in scenes 3, 4, 8, 10, and 11. The next column says real or abstract. What's that? Broadly speaking, we can divide the 12 scenes into these two categories. The abstract scenes, the ones like images in the mind, what I suppose we could almost call mental landscapes. And the real ones, scenes of things that really exist, that you could actually look at with your eyes. That's how I divided them up. Here, Ryuji paused for a second. Now, look at the chart. Notice anything? Well, your black curtain only comes down on the real scenes. Right, that's absolutely right. Keep that in mind. Ryuji, this is getting annoying. Hurry up and tell me what you're driving at. What does this mean? Now, hold your horses. Sometimes when one is given the answers up front, it dulls one's intuition. My intuition has already led me to a conclusion, and now that I have that in mind, I'll twist any phenomenon to rationalize holding on to that conclusion. It's like that in criminal investigations too, isn't it? Once you get the notion that he's the guy, it suddenly seems like all the evidence agrees with you. See, we can't afford to wander off the track here. I need you to back up my conclusion. That is, I want to see, once you've taken a look at the evidence, if your intuition tells you the same thing mine told me. Okay, get on with it. All right. The black curtain only appears when the screen is showing real landscapes. We've established that. Now, cast your mind back on the sensation you felt the first time you saw these images. We discussed the scene with the infant yesterday. Anything besides that? What about the scene with all the faces? Ryuji used the remote to find the scene. Take a good, long look at those faces. The wall of dozens of faces slowly retreated, the numbers swelling into the hundreds, the thousands. When he looked closely at them, each one seemed different, just like real faces. How does this make you feel? Ryuji asked. Like somehow I'm the one being reproached. Like they're calling me a liar. A fraud. Right. As it happens, I felt the same thing, or at least, what I felt was very similar to the sensation you're describing. Asakawa tried to concentrate his nerves on where this fact led. Ryuji was awaiting a clear response. Well? Asked Ryuji again. Asakawa shook his head. It's no good. I've got nothing. Well, if you had the leisure to spend more time thinking about it, you might notice the same thing I did. See, both of us have been thinking that these images were captured by a TV camera. In other words, by a machine with a lens, no? They weren't? Well, what's this black curtain that momentarily covers the screen? Ryuji advanced the film frame by frame until the screen went black. It stayed black for 3 or 4 frames. If you calculated one frame at a 30th of a second, then the darkness lasted for about a 10th of a second. Why does this happen in the real scenes and not the imagined ones? Look more closely at the screen. It's not completely black. Asakawa brought his face closer to the screen. Indeed, it wasn't totally dark. Something like a faint white haze hung suspended within the darkness. A blurred shadow. What we have here is the persistence of vision. And as you watch, don't you get an incredible sense of immediacy, as if you're actually a participant in the scene? Ryuji looked Asakawa full in the face and blinked once, slowly. The black curtain. Huh? Murmured Asakawa. Is this the blink of an eye? Exactly. Am I wrong? If you think about it, it's consistent. There are things we see with our eyes, but there are also scenes we conjure up in our minds. And since these don't pass through the retina, there's no blinking involved. But when we actually look with our eyes, the images are formed according to the strength of the light that hits the retina. And to keep the retina from drying out, we blink. Unconsciously. The black curtain is the instant when the eyes are shut. Once again, Asakawa was filled with nausea. The first time he'd finished watching the video, he'd run to the toilet. But this time the evil chill was even worse. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had climbed into his body. This video hadn't been recorded by a machine. A human being's eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin. All 5 senses had been used to make this video. These chills, this shivering, were from somebody's shadow sneaking into him through his sense organs. Asakawa had been watching the video from the same perspective as this thing within him. He mopped his brow again and again, but still it was damp with cold sweat. Did you know? Hey, are you listening? Individual differences aside, the average man blinks 20 times a minute, and the average woman 15 times. That means that it might have been a woman who recorded these images. Asakawa couldn't hear him. What's the matter? You look like you're dead already, you're so pale. Ryuji laughed. Look on the bright side. We're one step closer to a solution now. If these images were collected by the sense organs of a particular person, then the charm must have something to do with that person's will. In other words, maybe she wants us to do something. Asakawa had temporarily lost his faculty of reason. Ryuji's words vibrated in his ears, but their meaning didn't make it to his brain. At any rate, we now know what we have to do. We have to find out who this person is. Or was. I think he or she is probably no longer with us. And then we have to find out what this person desired while he or she was still alive. And that'll be the charm that will allow us to go on living. Ryuji winked at Asakawa, as if to say, how am I doing? Asakawa had left the number 3 Tokyo-Yokohama freeway and was now heading south on the Yokohama-Yokosuka road. Ryuji had reclined the passenger seat and was sleeping a perfect, stressless sleep. It was almost 2 in the afternoon, but Asakawa wasn't the least bit hungry. Asakawa reached out a hand to wake Ryuji, but then pulled it back. They weren't at their destination yet. Asakawa didn't even really know what their destination was. All Ryuji had done was tell him to drive to Kamakura. He didn't know where they were going or why they were going there. It made him a nervous, irritable driver. Ryuji had packed in a hurry, saying he'd explain where they were going once they were in the car. But once underway, he'd said, "I didn't sleep last night. Don't wake me till Kamakura," and then he'd promptly gone to sleep. He exited the Yokohama-Yokosuka road at Asahina, and then took the Kanazawa road 5 kilometers until they reached Kamakura Station. Ryuji had been asleep for a good 2 hours. "Hey, we're here," said Asakawa, shaking him. Ryuji stretched his body like a cat, rubbed his eyes with the backs of his hands, and shook his head rapidly from side to side, lips flapping. I was just having such a pleasant dream." "What do we do now?" Ryuji sat up and looked out the window to see where he was. "Just go straight on this road, and then when you reach the outer gate to the Hachiman's shrine, turn left and stop." Then Ryuji went to lie down again, saying, "Maybe I can still catch the tail end of that dream, if you don't mind." "Look, we'll be there in 5 minutes. If you've got time to sleep, you've got time to explain to me what we're doing here." "You'll see once we get there," said Ryuji, jamming his knees up against the dashboard and going back to sleep. Asakawa made the left and stopped. Dead ahead was an old 2-story house with a small sign reading, "Tetsuzo Miura Memorial Hall." "Pull into the parking lot." Ryuji had apparently opened his eyes slightly. He wore a satisfied look, and his nostrils were flared like he was sniffing perfume. "Thanks to you, I was able to finish that dream." "What was it about?" asked Asakawa as he turned the steering wheel. "What do you think? I was flying. I love dreams where I'm flying." Ryuji snorted happily and licked his lips. The Tetsuzo Miura Memorial Hall looked deserted. A large open space on the ground floor featured photographs and documents in frames on the wall or in cases under glass, and an outline of this Miura Fellow's achievements was plastered onto the center wall. Reading it, Asakawa finally figured out who the man was. "Excuse me, is anyone here?" called Ryuji into the depths of the building. There was no reply. Tetsuzo Miura had died 2 years ago at the age of 72, after retiring from a professorship at Yokodai University. He had specialized in theoretical physics, concentrating on theories of matter and statistical dynamics. But the Memories Hall, modest as it was, didn't result from his achievements as a physicist, but from his scientific investigations of paranormal phenomena. The resume on the wall claimed that the professor's theories had attracted worldwide interest, although undoubtedly only a limited number of people had actually paid any attention. After all, Asakawa had never even heard of the guy. And what exactly were this man's theories? To find the answer, Asakawa began to examine the items on the walls and in the display cases. Thoughts have energy, and that energy... Asakawa had read this far when he heard, echoing from another room, the sound of someone hurrying downstairs. A door opened and a 40-ish man with a mustache poked his head in. Ryuji approached the man, holding out one of his business cards. Asakawa decided to follow his example and took his own card holder from his breast pocket. "My name is Takayama. I'm at Fukuzawa University." He spoke smoothly and affably. Asakawa was amused at how different he sounded. Asakawa held out his own card. Faced with the credentials of an academic and a reporter, the man looked rather dismayed. It was Asakawa's card he was frowning at. If it's all right, there's something we'd like to consult with you about. What would that be? The man eyed them cautiously. As a matter of fact, I once had the pleasure of meeting the late Professor Miura. For some reason, the man seemed relieved to hear this, and relaxed his expression. He brought out 3 folding chairs and arranged them to face each other. Is that so? Please, have a seat. It must have been about 3 years ago. Yes, that's right. It was the year before he died. My alma mater was sounding me out about possibly giving a lecture on the scientific method, and I thought I might take the opportunity to hear what the professor had to say. Was it here, in this house? Yes, Professor Takatsuka introduced us. Hearing this name, the man at last smiled. He realized he had something in common with his visitors. These 2 must be on our side. They're not here to attack us after all. I see. I'm sorry about all that. My name is Tetsuaki Miura. Sorry, I'm fresh out of business cards. So, you must be the professor's... Yes, I'm his only son. Hardly worthy of the name, though. Is that right? Well, I had no idea the professor had such an outstanding son. It was all Asakawa could do to keep from laughing at the sight of Ryuji addressing a man 10 years older than himself and calling him an outstanding son. Tetsuaki Miura showed them around briefly. Some of his late father's students had got together after his death to open the house to the public, and to put in order the materials he'd collected over the years. As for Tetsuaki himself, he said, somewhat self-deprecatingly, that he hadn't been able to become a researcher like his father had wanted, but instead had built an inn on the same lot as the hall, and devoted himself to managing it. So here I am, exploiting both his land and his reputation. Like I say, I'm hardly a worthy son. Tetsuaki gave a chagrined laugh. His inn was used largely for high school excursions, mostly physics and biology clubs, but he also mentioned a group devoted to parapsychological research. High school clubs needed to have a reason to go on trips. Basically, the memorial hall was bait to bring in student groups. By the way, Ryuji sat straight up and tried to guide the conversation to the heart of the matter. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I've been boring you, babbling on like this. So tell me, what brings you here? It was apparent that Tetsuaki didn't have much in the way of talent for science. He was nothing but a merchant who adjusted his attitude to suit the situation. Asakawa could tell that Ryuji thought little of the man. To tell you the truth, we're looking for someone. Who? Actually, we don't know the name. That's why we're here. I'm afraid I don't follow you. Tetsuaki looked troubled, as if to urge his visitors to make a little more sense. We can't even say for sure if this person is still alive or has already died. What's clear is that this person had powers that ordinary people don't. Ryuji paused to watch Tetsuaki, who seemed to understand immediately what he meant. Your father was probably Japan's greatest collector of this sort of information. He told me that, using a network of connections he himself had forged, he had assembled a list of people all over the country with paranormal powers. He said he was storing the information. Tetsuaki's face clouded over. Surely they weren't going to ask him to search through all those records for a single name. Yes, of course the files have been preserved. But there are so many of them, and many of those people are frauds anyway. Tetsuaki blanched at the thought of looking through all those files again. It had taken a dozen of his father's students several months to organize them. Following the wishes of the deceased, they'd included even uncertain cases, swelling the number of files even further. We certainly don't intend to put you to any trouble. With your permission, we'll search through them ourselves, just the 2 of us. They're in the archives upstairs. Perhaps you'd like to take a look at them first? Tetsuaki stood up. They could only talk like that because they had no idea how much there was. Once they had a look at all those shelves, He had a feeling they wouldn't feel like tackling them. He led them to the second floor. The archives were in a high-ceilinged room at the end of the stairs. They entered the room to find themselves facing 2 bookcases of 7 shelves each. Each file book contained materials relating to 40 cases, and at first glance there seemed to be thousands of file books. Asakawa didn't notice Ryuji's reaction. He was too busy turning pale himself. If we spend time on this, we could well die here in this gloomy room. There's got to be another way. Ryuji, unfazed, asked, "Do you mind if we have a look?" "Go right ahead." Tetsuaki stayed and watched them for a while, half out of astonishment and half out of curiosity to see just what they thought they'd find. But eventually he seemed to have given up on them. "I've got work to do," he said, leaving. When they were alone, Asakawa turned to Ryuji and spoke. "So, want to tell me what's going on?" His voice was a bit thick, because he was still craning his neck looking at all the files. These were the first words he'd spoken since entering the hall. The files were arranged in chronological order, beginning with 1956 and ending in 1988. 1988. That was the year Miura had died. Only death had brought down the curtain on his 32-year quest. "We don't have much time, so I'll tell you while we look. I'll start with 1956, you start with 1960. Asakawa tentatively pulled out a file and flipped through it. Each page contained at least one photo and a piece of paper on which was written a short description as well as a name and an address. "What am I looking for?" "Pay attention to names and addresses. We're trying to find a woman from Izu Oshima Island." "A woman?" asked Asakawa, cocking his head questioningly. "Remember that old woman on the video? She told somebody they were going to give birth to a daughter. Think she was talking to a man?" Ryuji was right. Men could not bear children. So they started searching. It was a simple, repetitive task, and since Asakawa asked why these files existed in the first place, Ryuji explained. Professor Miura had always been interested in supernatural phenomena. In the 50s, he'd begun experiments with paranormal powers, but he hadn't gotten any results reliable enough to allow him to formulate a scientific theory. Clairvoyants would find themselves unable to do in front of an audience what they had done easily before. It took a lot of concentration to be able to display these powers. What Professor Miura was searching for was the kind of person who could exert his or her power at any time, under any circumstances. He could see that if the person failed in front of witnesses, then Miura himself would be called a fraud. He was convinced that there must be more people out there with paranormal powers that he knew about, so he set about finding them. But how was he to do this? He couldn't interview everybody to check for clairvoyance, second sight, telekinesis. So he came up with a method. To anybody who might possibly have such powers, he sent a piece of film in a securely sealed envelope and asked them to imprint upon it with their minds a certain pattern or image, and then send it back to him, still sealed. In this way, he could test the powers of people even at great distances. And since such psychic photography seemed to be a fairly basic power, people who possessed it often seemed to be clairvoyant as well. In 1956, he'd begun to recruit paranormals from all over the country, with the help of former students of his who had gone to work for publishers and newspapers. These former students helped set up a network which would report any rumor of supernatural powers straight back to Professor Miura. However, an examination of the film returned to him suggested that no more than a tenth of claimants actually had any power. The rest had skillfully broken the seal and replaced the film. Obvious cases of deception were weeded out at this point, but cases where it wasn't clear one way or the other were kept, ultimately resulting in the unmanageable collection Asakawa saw before him. In the years since Miura had started, the network had been perfected through the development of the mass media and an increase in the number of participating former students. The data had piled up year after year until the man died. "I see," murmured Asakawa. So that's the meaning of this collection. But how do you know that the name of the person we're looking for is in here? I'm not saying it definitely is, but there's a strong possibility it's here. I mean, look at what she did. You know yourself that there are a few people who can actually produce psychic photos. But there can't be too many paranormals who can actually project images onto a television tube without any equipment whatsoever. That's power of the very highest order. Someone with that kind of power would stand out, even if they didn't try to. I don't think Miura's network would have let someone like that slip through. Asakawa had to admit that the possibility was genuine. He redoubled his efforts. By the way, why am I looking at 1960? Asakawa suddenly looked up. Remember the scene on the video that shows a television? It was a rather old model, one of the early sets from the 50s or early 60s. But that doesn't necessarily mean... Shut up. We're talking probabilities here, right? Asakawa chided himself for being so irritated this last little while, but he had good reason to be. Given the limited time frame, the number of files was huge. It would have been more unnatural to be calm about it. At that moment, Asakawa saw the words Izu Oshima in the file he was holding. Hey, got one, he yelled triumphantly. Ryuji turned around, surprised, and peered at the file. Motor Nachi, Izu Oshima, Teruko Tsuchida, age 37, postmarked February 14th, 1960. A black and white photograph showing a white lightning-like slash against a black background. The description read, subject sent this with a note predicting a cross-shaped image. No traces of substitution. How about that? Asakawa trembled with excitement as he waited for Ryuji's response. It's a possibility. Take down the name and address, just in case. Ryuji turned back to his own search. Asakawa felt better for having found a likely candidate so soon, but at the same time he was dissatisfied with Ryuji's brusque reaction. 2 hours passed. They didn't find another woman from Izu Oshima. Most of the submissions were either from Tokyo itself or the surrounding Kanto region. Tetsuaki appeared, offering them tea and 2 or 3 possibly sarcastic comments before leaving. Their hands on the files were getting slower and slower. They'd been at it for 2 hours and hadn't even polished off a year's worth. Finally, somehow, Asakawa got through 1960. As he went to start on 1961, he happened to glance at Ryuji. Ryuji was sitting cross-legged on the floor, motionless, face buried in an open file. Is he asleep, the idiot? Asakawa reached out his hand, but then Ryuji emitted a stifled groan. I'm so hungry I could die. How about you go and buy us some takeout and oolong tea? Oh, and make reservations for this evening at Le Petit Pension Soleil. What the hell? That's the inn the guy runs. I know that, but why would I want to stay there with you? You'd rather not? For starters, we haven't got time to lounge around at an inn. Even if we find her now, there's no way to get to Izu Oshima right now. We can't go anywhere today. Don't you think it'd be better to get a good night's sleep and marshal our energies for tomorrow? Asakawa felt an indescribable aversion to spending the night with Ryuji at an inn. But there was no alternative, so he gave up and went out to buy food and tell Tetsuaki Miura they'd be staying the night. Then he and Ryuji ate their takeout and drank their oolong tea. It was 7 in the evening. A brief respite. His arms were tired and his shoulders stiff. His eyes swam. He took off his glasses. Instead, he held the files close enough to his face that he could lick them if he wanted. He had to use all his concentration, or he was afraid he'd miss something, which tired him even more. 9 o'clock. The silence of the archives was broken by Ryuji's mad screech. I found it! Finally! So that's where she was hiding! Asakawa felt himself drawn to the file. He sat down next to Ryuji and put his glasses back on to look at it. It said, Izu Oshima, Sashi Kiji, Sadako Yamamura, age 10. The envelope was postmarked August 29th, 1958. Subject sent this with a note predicting it would be imprinted with her own name. She's the real thing, without a doubt. Attached was a photograph showing the character Yama, mountain, in white against a black background. Asakawa had seen that character somewhere before. That's it. His voice trembled. On the video, the scene of the eruption of Mount Mahara had been followed immediately by a shot of the character from Mountain, identical to this one. Not only that, the screen of the old television in the 10th scene had displayed the character Sada. This woman's name was Sadako Yamamura. What do you think? Asked Ryuji. No question about it. This is it. At long last, Asakawa found hope. The thought crossed his mind that maybe, just maybe, they'd beat the deadline.